Beyond Barbarossa, Episode 73, Forward to the Past, The Battle for Berlin. Welcome to Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Redbeard Studio on traditional Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, also called Ottawa, in the free, sovereign, independent nation of Canada, a country that will never be the 51st part of anything. And I'm joined today by my stalwart assistant, Ragnar the Magnificent. And he's making himself very busy, rubbing against my iPad and avoiding the keyboard. Before we go on, I just want to remind you all that Patreon supporters get episodes early and ad-free. Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support you want. This episode, we're doing something a little different. We're breaking from the strict chronology of the war on the Eastern Front to take a look forward from the point of view of the past episodes. For the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe, we're going to look at the final battle for the German capital, Berlin. To help us, we're joined by Anthony Tucker-Jones, author of, you guessed it, The Fall of Berlin, The Final Days of Hitler's Evil Regime. Mr. Tucker-Jones has also written a large number of other books that I have depended on for research and writing this podcast. These include Slaughter on the Eastern Front, Hitler and Stalin's War 1939 to 1945, Falaise, The Flawed Victory, Operation Bagration and the Annihilation of Army Group Center, Hitler's Armed SS, the Waffen-SS at War 1939 to 1945, and many more. Because we're going back 80 years instead of 81, this brings us to mid-April 1945. At this point, everyone but Adolf Hitler and his most fanatical believers know they've lost the war. And most of the fanatics know it too. They're just not always as willing to admit it. By the 16th of April 1945, the American forces reached the Elbe River in the middle of Germany. The British were making rapid advances in northern Germany. The Canadians were systematically wearing out and bringing down the Nazis in the Netherlands, and the Free French were advancing into the Black Forest. Hitler's favorite field marshal, Walter Model, and the 300,000 men of his Army Group B were surrounded in the Ruhr pocket near Essen, where they would soon surrender to the Americans, and Model would shoot himself. Meanwhile, to the east, the Red Army has nearly 2 million troops on the Oder and Neisse rivers, which means the Allied forces are about 50 miles on either side of the German capital. On 16 April, the first Belorussian Front of the Red Army launched its final drive on Berlin, starting, as always, with a massive artillery barrage. And for the next 3.5 weeks, they would conduct a campaign of destruction and brutality. To take us through all of this, I've turned to Mr. Tucker-Jones, author of, as I said, The Fall of Berlin. For our listeners, can you tell us just a bit about yourself?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. I'm a British military historian. I've written an embarrassingly large number of books. I'm interested in all aspects of military history, but these days I do tend to specialise in the Second World War, particularly the sort of 44-45 campaigns. Hence, sort of an interest in latter half of the Eastern Front, obviously the fall of Berlin, and then sort of Northwest Europe campaigns from D-Day onwards.
What was it that drew you to that particular part of the war? A lot of people are fascinated with the Second World War, but why the end, I guess, of it?
I think probably because it's essentially obviously the turn of the tide. So up until 43, the Axis powers pretty much have things going their own way. And of course, once the Americans get involved, and particularly the Soviet Union, the war takes on a much more different aspect in terms of the way Britain's obviously, fighting on its own, but with the support of the British Empire and the Commonwealth. So strategically, the options for Britain and then obviously allies become much broader certainly post December 41 when America enters. And then, of course, it's then really amongst the three key allies on how it is that they are going to facilitate the destruction of Nazi Germany, obviously, and its Axis allies. So that's the thing that sort of fascinates me. Like most people, I'm always fascinated, particularly by D-Day, because, of course, with rose-tinted glasses and the benefit of hindsight, we tend to think of how could it have gone any other way. It's such a remarkable success. The planning was meticulous. Whereas the reality, of course, is it could have gone much different. And also the thing certainly with D-Day and then post D-Day is the German reaction to the opening of the Second Front. They continually make strategic and tactical mistakes, which ultimately cost them the war. And they do that both on the Western Front and on the Eastern Front. Happy to discuss that a bit more. But primarily, of course, what Hitler does is he hobbles his generals by trying to micromanage the conduct of the war from Germany's perspective. Largely, I think, because he was so enamored of the success of Blitzkrieg in 40-41, he was desperate to recapture those glory days. And of course, it got to the point where he felt he was the one that knew best. Yes. Despite, of course, those victories have been achieved by his generals. Whereas in contrast, of course, in the West, the Allies appointed a Supreme Allied Commander in the shape of Eisenhower. So the strategic conduct of the war, although it had obviously political oversight, there was a layer of mid-level military management, if you like, which Germany did not have. And indeed, bizarrely, Stalin went the other way as well, because he tried to micromanage the war at the very beginning with absolutely disastrous results. And I think once he was confident he was not going to be replaced by a military coup after Moscow was saved, he became much more relaxed in relying on the judgment of his generals. And certainly sort of from the summer of 41 and then up until early 42, he did not do that. He tended to override their decisions, which cost the Red Army dearly. But slowly but surely, he began to sort of take his hand off the steering wheel, if you like, and relax more and rely more on the judgment of, obviously Zhukov, Konoyev and Rokossovsky, who were his key front commanders. He began to rely much more on their judgment in the strategic and, again, tactical conduct of the war.
Right. Well, what I want to do is focus on at that very end. We're coming up to the 80th anniversary of the final fall of Berlin. So could I just ask you, given that we've mentioned Stalin, we've mentioned the senior field military officers on the Eastern Front, can you take the audience through the last few days at the end of April and the beginning of May 1945?
Well, essentially, the fall of Berlin really is a political battle, in that as Nazi Germany collapsed very rapidly, Stalin became alarmed at the prospect of the Western Allies getting to Berlin before him, even though it had been agreed that Berlin would be within the Soviet occupation zone in what later became Eastern Germany. It had been agreed. The Allies in the West began to make such rapid advances. Stalin became convinced that Churchill actually might make a run for Berlin. And one of the things that, although it had been agreed the Allies would have a foothold in Berlin, what Stalin did not want was the Western Allies carving themselves a sizable corridor or peninsula from their portion of occupied Germany to Berlin, because that would hamper his ability to control the city and indeed control Allied access into it. As we know, he very successfully ended up cutting the city off during the Berlin blockade in 48. Right. So what he wanted to do was restrict Allied access to the city, and he felt confident that Roosevelt would honour the agreement, actually, that the Americans would not make a dash for it. But he was slightly worried that Churchill might renege on the agreement and get troops in there much quicker. And indeed, some American generals, most notably, I think, General Simpson with the US Ninth Army, they began to chafe at the bit once they were over the Rhine, and particularly once they got to the Elbe, they ended up roughly 50 miles from Berlin, which once the Red Army was at Kustrin on the Oder, they were of a similar distance from Berlin in the east. So
Yes.
you can see why suddenly Stalin is very much focused on, he doesn't want them to beat him, to take in the city. The other thing is, I think probably quite rightly, Stalin felt that the Red Army had done much of the heavy lifting during the Second World War and had shed a lot of blood and treasure,
Yes.
get itself to the gates of Berlin. I think he felt he was not going to fall at the final hurdle and have the Allies beat him. And that essentially is what ended up spurring what became the race for Berlin, both between the West and the East, but also amongst Stalin's generals, because initially it was agreed that Zhukov's first Belorussian Front, which was pretty much opposite Berlin to the east, would get the honor of taking the city.
Hmm.
But what Stalin did was he then played off Marshal Konev against Zhukov by saying, well, if Zhukov gets held up, Konev's first Ukrainian front to the south, well, they can make a run for the city as well. So suddenly you've got effectively two Russian army groups, those two fronts,
Right.
vying for the honor of taking Berlin. So that by mid-April 1945, that very much speeds up the process of the Red Army trying to take Berlin. And it becomes a rush, but it's important to remember that the Russians had actually got to the Oder by early February. And what
Yes.
Stalin did was he sat on his hands. He basically wasted 2.5 months because some of his generals felt that they should have made a run for Berlin in February and not waited until April.
Okay. Just want to back up just a bit. So, do you think that Stalin, given that he wants to be the first in Berlin and is worried about the Americans or the British getting there, was already planning post war long term occupation of at least half of Germany?
So almost certainly. I mean, they'd obviously agreed, the Allies had agreed amongst themselves to the partition of Germany. Germany was going to be, disarmed. It would be occupied. It would be rendered a neutral state to stop it waging the Third World War.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, amongst the Western Allies and indeed with the Soviets, that was a key concern. They did not want Germany rising from the ashes and vengeful of its defeat again. I mean, that's what had
Mm-hmm.
happened post First World War. So the Allies had agreed that would be the case. But I think Stalin had tried a forward defense at the beginning of the Second World War by trying to occupy a chunk of Finland and then obviously the Baltic states and also eastern Poland. So he very much had in his mind, he wanted a forward defense. And therefore, he needed to create a security buffer in Eastern Europe that would protect the Soviet Union from renewed German aggression. And of course, to do that, what it meant was he needed effectively to occupy Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the eastern portion of Germany, which it had been agreed that the Soviets would occupy part of the reparations against Nazi Germany. So, yes, I agree. I think Stalin was already looking at the future in that he wanted to carve out this big swathe of territory, which, of course, obviously, as we know, results in the Iron Curtain and the creation of the Warsaw Pact. But even before he's got himself into Berlin, he's thinking about what does he need to do to safeguard the Soviet Union's western borders, and that is essentially a very, very large land grab.
Yes, yes, it certainly was. Now, this race between Zhukov and Konev, were these two men, these two commanders, already rivals going into this?
Well, certainly. I mean, the nature of the Red Army was it was essentially based on being extremely tough and bullying. The Red Army had this culture of bullying, and also before the Second World War, it had been purged. Famously, Rokossovsky was let out of prison so that he could help defend the Soviet Union. Because he'd been arrested and subject to mock executions on numerous occasions, and he'd been tortured while he was in the Gulag. So the Red Army were very, very tough, but a lot of them were constantly looking over their shoulder,
Mm-hmm.
knowing full well that if they displeased Stalin or indeed Beria, who was in charge of the NKVD, the forerunner of the KGB, at best they would end up in the Gulag, and at worst they would end up in front of a firing squad.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, but also I think these men were career soldiers. They had come up through the ranks since the First World War, and the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. So they were career soldiers. So I think, understandably, both Zhukov and Konev had their eye on history as much as Stalin did. that they knew that if they were in command of the armies that took Berlin, it would secure their places in the history books. And let's face it, very few people in the West know many Soviet commanders from the Second World War, but most people have heard of Marshal Zhukov.
Yes.
He's kind of, if you like, for Britain, he's kind of the equivalent of Montgomery, and I guess for America, Patton in many ways, it's that sort of go-getting general. So he has that sort of level, that profile that many other Soviet commanders do not enjoy. And of course, that's it partly in virtue by the fact that he saved Leningrad, and also that he helped with the planning of Kursk, and likewise with Bagration, liberating Western Russia and getting to the gates of Warsaw. So he was slowly securing his place in the history books. And of course, that's sadly why he was sidelined after the Second World War, was because his star was beginning to eclipse that of Stalin's, which Stalin did not like, and also undoubtedly saw him as a threat, that he was a potential future Soviet leader, which could displace him. So, after the war, Zhukov ended up being treated quite shabbily.
Yes. And for all you listeners, there is a 3-part special series on Zhukov for Patreon patrons. So do look that up.
He is a fascinating general because, of course, he was pretty forward thinking, because he was involved in the late 1930s with the fighting against the Japanese army in Mongolia. So he'd already experienced what we would consider to be all arms or combined arms operations, combining the use of fighter bombers with tanks and artillery. And he had done that against the Japanese, in 1939. So he'd already cut his teeth, not to mention his earlier career as well, but he'd already cut his teeth in what we would consider blitzkrieg style tactics.
Okay, well, let's take a brief break just to refill our water or our coffee or tea or whatever it is we're drinking, and we'll be right back with Anthony Tucker Jones, author of The Fall of Berlin, The Final Days of Hitler's Evil Regime. Thanks for coming back. This is part 2 of episode 73, a conversation with Anthony Tucker Jones, author of The Fall of Berlin, The Final Days of Hitler's Evil Regime. Anthony, why wasn't Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front part of that competition, that race to the capital?
Well, that goes back to what I was saying earlier about, although the Red Army got to the Oder in February, there was then a 2.5-month hiatus. And the reason for that was counterattacks on the Soviets' northern flank had convinced Stalin that he needed to subdue Pomerania and East Prussia. And that took time. And it was Rokossovsky who got the job of doing that. So he was basically tied up to the north, because Stalin, and I suspect Zhukov as well, they were concerned that if they made a grab for Berlin, the Red Army's right flank would be exposed to attack from the north. And what Stalin wanted to do was ensure that did not happen. Even amongst Soviet generals, there's been much discussion as to whether that was the right decision. I don't think it was. I think, Stalin probably could have ended the war a lot quicker, largely because all the large numbers of German troops that were in Prussia and Pomerania and in the Baltic states were not mobile as such. It had a lot of manpower there, but they were short on vehicles and tanks and what have you. So they did not really constitute a major mobile threat to Stalin's flank, but that was not a chance he was going to take. So what it meant was that Rokossovsky's forces had to subdue all the Baltic coast ports, so principally Königsberg, which is the capital of Prussia, and then Danzig as well, which of course is in modern-day Poland, and Königsberg is now Kaliningrad and is part of the Soviet Union, bizarrely. Between those two ports are a whole row of others, and of course as the Red Army advanced, Hitler did his usual thing of demand that each port was turned into a fortress, and they were held to the last. And what the Germans were forced to do, obviously, was slowly evacuate their troops westwards along the Baltic coast, apart from in the Courland Peninsula, where there's an entire army group trapped, some 300,000 troops, again, tied up doing nothing. It's the same with the troops that Hitler had in Norway. They were tied up doing nothing.
200,000 occupation troops just in Norway.
Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. And again, Courland Peninsula, there's about 300,000 of them are there. We've got 500,000 troops. And indeed, General Heinz Guderian, who at this point was chief of the general staff of the German army, he kept pleading with Hitler, saying, we need to evacuate the occupied territories. and bring those forces home to defend Germany and Berlin. And Hitler would hear none of it. And yet, of course, the Germans still had reasonably free movement within the Baltic. I mean, the Red Fleet was active, as was the Red Air Force, and some troops were withdrawn from the Courland Peninsula, but Hitler would not withdraw all of them, which he should have done. Common sense dictated as soon as, particularly once the Vistula-Oder offensive started back in January 1945. As soon as that started, common sense dictated Hitler should have brought all his troops home.
Yes.
To defend, the fatherland, but he refused to do that, which of course meant that the Germans actually were quite short of troops, which again hampered their options in terms of how they defended Berlin. But it wasn't, going back to the Baltic coast, it wasn't until 9th of April that Königsberg was captured. I mean, it proved an incredibly tough nut for the Red Army to take. I mean, the fighting there and along the strip of territory, I think it's to the north of Samland, I'm going from memory, I think there's a peninsula land north of it. There were troops trapped there, and the battles to subdue the city and the pocket of troops, I mean, they were really, really bloody, and took a long time to do. And all the time, of course, that was happening, it actually bought time for Hitler in terms of preparing the defense of the Oder River and Berlin itself. So that's one of the reasons, that's the key reason why Rokossovsky was not involved sooner, and indeed why Stalin delayed the assault on Berlin, whereas he could have done it much sooner. I say there are two schools of thought. One says he did the right thing by securing his right flank. Another school of thought says actually it was a waste of time. He should have struck at Berlin in February, and the outcome probably would have been the same.
Yes, but we can argue in hindsight forever. Focusing on the fall of Berlin itself, then, a lot of books I've read start that with the battle for the Seelow Heights, the horseshoe-shaped highland to the east of Berlin. Why does it make sense to start the description at that point?
Well, essentially for the Red Army, after they got to the city of Kustrin on the Oder, they had created two bridgeheads over the Oder. So they were actually on the west bank of the Oder already. During February and March, what the Red Army did was it joined those two bridgeheads together. So they ended up with this strip of land, I think it was about 10 miles deep by about 30 miles long. So they already had a bridgehead, to the east of Berlin. But between the river and Berlin, as you say, is this series of heights called the Seelow Heights. And it's essentially the last defensive geographic feature before you get to Berlin. So in terms of defending Berlin, you've got the Oder River. Well, once that's lost, that's gone. And after the Oder River, you've got the Seelow Heights. So that's why most historians view the Battle of the Seelow Heights actually as the commencement, if you will, for the Red Army's attempt on Berlin. Because really, certainly for the German army, the Seelow Heights represent their only defensible position. If they cannot stop the Red Army on those heights, they're not going to stop them on the road to Berlin, or indeed once they get into Berlin, it's pretty much a fait accompli. But it's interesting to remember that actually the battle for Berlin is a series of battles, because you end up with various relief options which Hitler tried to achieve. They were never practical, but essentially to the north, you have a battle involving 3rd Panzer Army, which is trying to fend off the advancing Red Army to the north of Berlin. And you've also got something that was grandly called the 11th SS Panzer Army, which Hitler got into his head was a full-strength army that could march on Berlin to help relieve the city. And then likewise to the south, there were two other German armies. You had the 9th Army, which was holding the Oder and the Seelow Heights. And then to the southwest of Berlin, you had a newly created army called 12th Army, which had been formed to hold the River Elbe, so to stop the Americans getting over the Elbe River and driving on Berlin. So you've essentially got three armies within fairly close proximity of Berlin, all of which Hitler wanted to come to the rescue of the capital. And as a result, you end up with this sort of series of disjointed and disparate battles, as well as the fight on the Seelow Heights. Because once the German army is driven off the Seelow Heights, it's then a question for essentially General Heinrici, who commanded Army Group Vistula. The question then for him is, does he withdraw his troops into Berlin and conduct major urban warfare, which is a fairly pointless exercise because the Russians have won. They're going to surround. They're going to
Yes.
surround the capital anyway. Or does he conduct some sort of fighting withdrawal to the south of Berlin and try and reach the Americans, who, most Germans recognise are probably going to be more lenient in their treatment of members of the Wehrmacht than the Red Army is going to be. There's this amongst the civilian population, the German armed forces, as the battle for Berlin progresses, there's this increasing desperation to try and escape westwards, to at least to fall into the hands of the Americans.
There was a definite preference to be captured by the Western allies as opposed to the Red Army. Did they know the stories of mass rape and the spoliation of their farms and other resources?
So I mean, the Red Army gave back to Germany what the German armed forces had done on the
Mm-hmm.
Eastern Front. Where human rights abuses, as we well know, were absolutely appalling. Rape, pillage, torture, killing of prisoners. Murder of the intelligentsia. Obviously, the final solution when it came to the Jews as well. So the Germans knew full well how they were going to get treated, and of course, as the Red Army plodded across or cut its way across Eastern Germany, reports obviously began to filter back to Berlin and other cities about how the inhabitants were treated, and it was not good.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you had a great swathe of refugees fleeing in front of the Red Army anyway, trying to head west to escape from. I think even your average German must have known that Eastern Germany was probably going to be occupied by the Red Army for some considerable time, and
Mm-hmm.
in which case that was not somewhere you would want to live. So yes, I think there was this air of terror certainly amongst the civilian population, the armed forces, about falling into the hands of the Red Army. Many senior German generals, of course, were guilty of war crimes on the Eastern Front, so they knew what was going to happen to them. They would be put on trial and shot. So again, there was this desperation to try and avoid that if they could. And I think certainly the sense on the Eastern Front, the sense of desperation, was driven by the fact, of course, again, going back to this fortress mentality that Hitler
Mm-hmm.
had, whereby he insisted that every city be held. Breslau was a prime example of that, which it held out until the very end of the war. Poznan and various other cities, they'd all been turned into these fortress cities, which on the whole left the civilian populations with nowhere to go. It was a lot of the battles were like something out of the Middle Ages, because in times gone by, if a city was offered quarter during the Middle Ages and it refused it knew what would happen. There would
Right.
be rape and pillage. Then when the army got in, and in many ways on the Eastern Front, it was just like that with Germany's cities, that they held out beyond reason, and therefore could expect no quarter, which is what regularly happened. Königsberg, again, prime example, ended up as an orgy of bloodletting once the Red Army got in there, largely because the Red Army commanders were, infuriated by this needless bloodletting when the garrisons were not going to go anywhere. They were not going to be rescued, because, again, that was part of Hitler's philosophy. If they held out as a fortress, then, reinforcements and a relief column would cut its way to them. But certainly by March 1945, that was not happening anywhere. So, again, it infuriated the Red Army as to why the German army and indeed the SS just continued to resist beyond all reason.
You mentioned the three armies around Berlin. Do you have an idea of how many troops that totaled?
As you'll appreciate, numbers vary enormously and
Yes.
are never terribly reliable, particularly if they come from Soviet sources. It's things like the history of the Great Patriotic War. You can only go on what they said with a pinch of salt. But essentially, on the Eastern Front by April 45, the Red Army's probably got about around about 2.5 million men under arms. Obviously, they're not all fighting men, but it's a huge number of troops. And opposite Berlin, Zhukov's probably got about 1 million. Soviet intelligence estimated that the Berlin garrison was 200,000. It was never anywhere near that number. And also estimated that the Germans probably had about 1 million troops on the Oder. Again, woefully
Mm.
inaccurate. Berlin garrison was probably about, I don't know, 80,000 at most. Again, figures vary. I've seen sort of 60 to 100. And likewise, the troops on the Oder probably were less than 500,000. They probably had about 400,000. And again, were not mobile. That's the trouble. And also, of
Mm-hmm.
course, by this stage of the war, the Luftwaffe is a spent force. So the Red Air Force, which has been rejuvenated and regenerated, particularly during 1944, pretty much had freedom of operation in the skies. So again, German movement on the ground, as it is on the Western Front, is greatly curtailed by constant fighter bomber attacks and fighter attacks,
Mm-hmm.
which tended to, every time they tried to mass for a counterattack, it would come under fighter bomber and artillery bombardment before they'd even got off to their jump-off point. So for the Germans, they've got a supply problem, they've got a freedom of movement problem, they've got a manpower problem, they've got an equipment problem. I think the main problem they've got is the lack of maneuverability, because the Russians are fighting a maneuver war. The Germans are not, because they're constantly tied to static fixed positions, again, such as the Seelow Heights,
Right.
by Hitler's unrelenting insistence that the German armed forces do not give ground anywhere, which
Right.
of course, as soon as you do that, it denies your commanders the initiative. They can't regroup. They can't maneuver to attack an enemy on the flank. They can't do anything. So it on the whole, it passed the initiative over to the Red Army all the time, which again is a fateful flaw in the German defensive strategy.
That brings me nicely to this next point. We're looking at this overwhelming superiority in numbers and in equipment of the Soviets versus the Germans. A lot of people have spoken about, written about, and some people have asked me about the increased professionalism of the Red Army in 1944, 1945, compared to the beginning of the war in the East. But it seems to me that at the same time, especially Zhukov, but the whole Red Army is still relying on the numbers, the just pushing. And Zhukov's attack was straightforward, drive straight in toward Berlin, just throw more numbers at them. So do you think that the Red Army really is that much more professional, or is it just now they've got more equipment?
No, I essentially agree with you. It's a blunt instrument, but it's a very well equipped blunt instrument. It's got a lot of tanks. Again, top of my head, something like 2,500, I think, massed for the assault on Berlin. It's got a lot of artillery. It's got a lot of tanks. It's got a lot of aircraft. Soviet factories have churned out all this equipment, which it's armed with. And also, essentially, what it's done is it's turned blitzkrieg. It's learned from blitzkrieg,
Mm-hmm.
and it's now doing its own Soviet version of blitzkrieg against the Germans. So it is vastly more professional than it was in 1941. Its generals are obviously a lot more experienced.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, as you rightly point out, it is a blunt instrument. They do bludgeon their way. This is largely because of the Soviet disregard for human life, that their armies are just resources to achieve anything. So normally, any sane commander, their first duty is to their men. Obviously, you want to achieve your objective, but the whole way of doing it is you ensure you do it with minimum losses. That
Mm-hmm.
tends to be the mantra, certainly modern military thinking and modern military commanders. Whereas, of course, with the Soviet Union, there wasn't quite so much of a need to do that. And in many ways, I suspect the Red Army was at its height of proficiency and professionalism and veterans in 1944, because increasingly by 1945, even the Soviet Union is scraping the bottom of the barrel for
Ah.
manpower. So we see a lot of accounts of there being language problems amongst the recruits in the Red Army, because they are drawn from non-Slavic, non-Russian, non-Belarusian or Ukrainian sources. They have come from Siberia and they come from the Central Asian states. So
Right.
increasingly, the Red Army has a lot of new recruits that are poorly disciplined, poorly trained, and essentially brought in as cannon fodder, I think.
Mm.
Particularly when it comes to Central Asian states, Moscow is going to have even less regard for your Tajiks and your Kazakhs and your Turkmenistanis and all those people
Mm-hmm.
than it is for your average Russian or average white Russian or average Ukrainian. So yes, in many ways, the Red Army has sort of become a victim of its own success by this point, that during June 1944, when Stalin launched his own version of D-Day with Operation
Right.
Bagration, the Red Army is pretty much at its height. But obviously, by the time it's got to the Oder, it's suffered the most appalling casualties covering that ground, taking Warsaw and getting to the Oder. So its divisions and its armies are increasingly being made up by recruits who often Russian is a second language, or indeed, in some instances, they have no Russian at all. So it makes command and control a real problem. Now, I don't know whether that's part of the Soviet narrative, because, of course, after the war, Moscow tended to blame them for rape and pillage that happened in Berlin. They kind of said it was a discipline issue, and they were non-European troops, and they didn't really know what they were doing. And so you're not quite sure how much of that Moscow made them a scapegoat, or whether that's actually true, that a big chunk of the Red Army
But don't
were now
forget that
non-Slavs.
Zhukov, though, said, well, what's the big problem if a man sees a skirt and decides to have a little fun?
Yes, and again, I'm afraid it was part and parcel of the Red Army's psyche of revenge. If you've been in Leningrad, or you've been in Stalingrad, or you've been in Sevastopol, or Grozny, or Kiev, or Odessa, and you've seen the absolutely appalling destruction, wrought upon your cities by Hitler's armed forces, you can understand that desire for revenge, but also total disregard for human life when it came to the Germans, because your average Russian's going to go, well, the Germans treated us like animals on the Eastern Front. The gloves are off. There's no chivalry here and this. Yes. So they treated the Germans pretty much the same way the Germans had treated them. So I'm not excusing it, because human rights abuses occur because of poor discipline. I mean, that's fundamentally it's command and control and training and disciplining your troops that stops that. Without condoning it, you can understand why it happens, simply because they had seen wholesale of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, my father-in-law fought in the Red Army, and he did say that while they were in Soviet territory, in Russia or in the Baltic states or in Poland, the officers told the men, hands off the women. When they crossed into German territory, the officers said, do what you want, boys. And on that horrifying note, we have to close this episode. Thank you, Anthony. Don't worry, listeners. We're going to finish this conversation in just a few days. Or more accurately, you'll get to hear the rest of this conversation in just a few days. It's just that we're getting close to the 40-minute mark, so I'm going to pause it here, and I'll bring the next episode, number 74, which will be part 2 of the Battle for Berlin episode with Anthony Tucker-Jones, author of The Fall of Berlin, The Final Days of Hitler's Evil Regime. And that will be live on all podcasting platforms on 2nd May, 80 years to the day when German forces in Berlin surrendered to the Red Army. Oops, sorry for the spoiler. So keep your podcast dial tuned to Beyond Barbarossa and set a reminder on your phone for 2nd May 2025. Talk to you then. And thank all of you listeners for downloading another episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. And special thanks to all who have supported the podcast through Patreon. I want to make a special shout out to Tom Gaffney, who's increased his membership to the VIP level. Welcome to the VIP club, Tom, and thanks very much for not only your contributions, but especially for your kind words. You can also be a supporter through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. As always, you can find maps and images to help clarify this episode's audio on the webpage for this episode. Go to beyondbarbarossa.ca or beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. Please consider following the show on your preferred podcasting app. Just hit that follow button, and don't forget you can also get email notifications about new episodes. Go to feedspot.com and select Beyond Barbarossa as one of your favorite podcasts. I'd also really appreciate a rating on Apple, Spotify, Podbean, or wherever you listen to podcasts. That not only tells me what kind of job I'm doing, but it helps spread the word to other people who are interested in history. Do you have something to say, to add, a question, or, though I hate to admit the possibility, a correction? I'd love to hear from you. Reach me by email at scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca or through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. Last point, Canada is and always will be a free, independent, and sovereign country. And we welcome visitors and newcomers. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. I'm Scott Burry. Until next episode, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina.